Namaskar and welcome to the last lecture on Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, which comes under the paper Indian Writing in English, MEG 7, Block 2. My name is Lalit Kumar. I teach English at Deen Dayal Upadhyaya College, University of Delhi. The title for this last lecture on Untouchable is Untouchable, Reception, Literary Criticism and Relevance. So, the lecture, as the title indicates, focuses on the reception of the novel and discusses the views of some prominent critics. So, first I will examine the contemporary relevance of the novel and then move on to analyze E.M. Forster's views on the novel, the novelist's views on the novel, that is Mulk Raj Anand, how Mulk Raj Anand reflects on the novel, and also in the concluding section I would like to closely analyze the opinion of three major contemporary critics on Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable. I would like to analyze their opinions on Anand's Untouchable, and these critics are Meenakshi Mukherjee, Gauri Vishwanathan and Priyambada Gopal. So, let us begin with the reception of the novel. Untouchable surprisingly was rejected by 19 publishers for 4 years, for no less than 4 years, and the 20th publisher accepted it only after E.M. Forster agreed to write the preface. On his recommendation, on E.M. Forster's recommendation, the left-wing publishing house called Lawrence and Wishart agreed to publish it in 1935, and the book was well received, selling out nearly all the copies. But in India it was rejected. It was dismissed as communist propaganda, with the Illustrated Weekly, the then famous Illustrated Weekly of India, dismissing it. Illustrated Weekly of India dismissed it. Untouchable has been translated into more than 30 languages of the world, and it is a part of Penguin Contemporary Classic series and also of World Book in America now. But the book met fierce opposition in the UK because the British were opposed to any sort of social criticism. Referring to the reception of his translations, Mulk Raj Anand said in an interview titled Mulk Raj Anand Remembers, that is the title of the interview given to the editor of Indian Literature in 1993, that the book became popular in Bengali and Malayalam, but not in Hindi, with an edition still lying in the godown. So, Anand found it strange that not even 100 copies of the book could be sold in Hindi as late as in 1992. This is how Mulk Raj Anand reflected on the novel in the 1990s. So, now I would like to talk about Forster's preface to the novel, how Forster discusses the novel, how E.M. Forster views the novel. E.M. Forster calls Untouchable a remarkable novel and asks the question, is it a clean book or a dirty one? Is it a dirty book? And calls it indescribably clean. He calls the novel indescribably clean. Indescribably clean. In fact, it was a part of the deal with the publisher, who agreed to bring it out only if E.M. Forster could write a preface to protect the book against being called dirty, because as publishers believed, it dealt with dung, it dealt with dirt. Forster argues in the preface that a novel like Untouchable could have been written only by an Indian who was an outside observer. And for Forster, being a Kshatriya, Anand had the right mixture of insight and detachment, and was the ideal outsider to depict the sufferings of the outcasts. So, Forster's claim about who should be the ideal author to portray Dalit experience is worth citing not only for our understanding of this novel, but also to analyze contemporary discourse on Dalit writings, to understand contemporary debates on Dalit writings. And I quote Foster, "No European, however sympathetic, could have created the character of Bhakha, because he would not have known enough about his troubles, and no Untouchable could have written the book, because he could have been involved in indignation and self-pity." I find this quite a contentious claim. This is a contentious claim to make. What about Dalit authors documenting their experiences, not only in fiction but also in poetry and autobiographies, which are being read as histories now? Foster would have discredited them, rejecting their writings, rejecting their oeuvre as a product of indignation and self-pity. Can indignation be a ground for the rejection of a literary work? Is detachment such an important criterion to accept or reject a literary work, that if some writers are being driven by indignation, their works will be rejected? Most probably not. I am saying not because though modern Dalit literature flourished only in the 1960s, it was characterized by anger and voices of protest. Dalit activists and authors call the representation of their lives by upper caste authors inauthentic and distorted. So, resentment, indignation characterize their writings. Can we reject them? Of course not. Just as Foster argues that no European could have produced a character like Bhakha, Dalit authors, Dalit activists would argue, may argue, that no upper caste author could do so either. And that is why I call Foster's claim a contentious one, especially in contemporary times. So, sometimes the claims of objectivity in a literary work can be an illusion. And suddenly I am reminded of, while delivering this lecture, I am reminded of a dialogue from one of Woody Allen's films, that objectivity can be subjective. After all, how much detachment one should have in order to pen down one's experience in literary form. So, not only in Dalit literature, but also in literary works of the black, the women, the Holocaust survivors, and all the persecuted ones, it is hard to look for a delicate balance between detachment and resentment, aesthetics and politics, and above all, art and propaganda. However, Foster's praise for Anand on the ground of the latter being an outsider should not be seen as his views on literature in general, but a customary prefatory kind of remark. Now, after analyzing Foster's understanding of the novel, after examining his foreword to the novel, let us move on to the author's views on the novel. How does the author reflect on the novel years later? How Anand reminisces about the novel years after its publication, describing the circumstances that led to its publication, mainly the factors that shaped the book. And here I would like to cite from one of the articles written by Mulk Raj Anand titled "How I Became a Writer." So, in this article, "How I Became a Writer," Anand argues that all his novels and shorter fiction arose from a confession of around 2000 pages. As no one agreed to publish such an enormous narrative, such a lengthy narrative, he took up some episodes and characters from there, experimented with them, and produced a novel. Untouchable was the first part of that experiment. And I am quoting from an essay written by Mulk Raj Anand in 1967, and the title of this essay is "The Story of My Experiment with a White Lie." The story of my experiment with a white lie, written in 1967, and I quote, "The book," which is Untouchable, The book poured out like hot lava. The book poured out like hot lava from the volcano of my crazed imagination during a long weekend. I remember that I had to do finger exercises in order to ease the strain on my right hand, and I must have slept only 6 hours in 3 nights. And even during those 6 hours, I kept on dreaming about several strains in the central character of Bhaka, almost as though I was molding his personality and transmuting it from actuality into the hero of a nightmare, unquote. So, there are some autobiographical influences on the novel, which I would like to discuss in the next segment of my lecture. Bhaka is a figure, Bhaka the protagonist is a figure from real life who Anand knew as a kid and adored him like a hero. The Bhaka Anand knew was physically like a god, played all the games superbly, and could recite whole cantos from the epic poem Heer Ranjha of Waris Shah. Anand builds upon the contradiction between the innate qualities of the young man and the low status assigned to him because of his birth. So, the tension between birth and merit is the hallmark of this novel, the story of this novel. Anand has cast himself in the novel, since the novel has some autobiographical influences. So, Anand casts himself in the novel in the form of the younger son of an influential Babu, and reminisces how as a boy Bhaka had carried him home when he had been hit by a stone thrown by Ramcharan, the washerman's son, without worrying about upsetting his mother for polluting her son. So, the character of Bhaka was a part of Anand's childhood. He has borrowed him from real life. So, Anand foregrounds Bhaka's love for physically weaker people. Very briefly here, I would also, apart from the autobiographical influences, I would also like to talk about, I would like to point out the literary influence on Mulk Raj Anand while he was writing Untouchable. In that respect, I will talk about James Joyce's Ulysses. 3 things that Mulk Raj Anand learnt from James Joyce's Ulysses and tried to incorporate them in Untouchable are: first, the unity of time and space. First, the idea that the unity of time and space could be achieved all in one day of the life of a character. That is the first thing that he learnt from Ulysses. Since we are talking about literary influence of James Joyce on Mulk Raj Anand after discussing the autobiographical influences. So, this is the first lesson that he learnt: the unity of time and space could be achieved all in one day of the life of a character. Second, a stream of consciousness of the people could be used to suggest value judgments about the characters. Third, the age of conventional novel with a beginning, a middle and an end was over, and one could produce a novel out of anything. And all these things Mulk Raj Anand talks about. He talks about literary influences and autobiographical influences in his essay, The Story of My Experiment with a White Lie. So, this is how he reflects on the novel. So, those who want to read more about the ways in which Mulk Raj Anand reflects on Untouchable should read this essay, may read this essay, entire essay. So, now I would like to talk about the reception of the novel with reference to 3 major critics, 3 contemporary critics, eminent critics, and I begin with Meenakshi Mukherjee, how Meenakshi Mukherjee perceived Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable. In his critically acclaimed book, The Choice-Born Fiction, Themes and Techniques of the Indian Novel in English, that came out in 1971, Meenakshi Mukherjee divides the novelists writing between 1920 and 1950 into 2 groups. One who carried the burden of commitment driven by the ideological beliefs, and the other who documented their experiences as observers and chroniclers. Mukherjee places Anand in the former category and discusses his passionate progressivism. So I quote Mukherjee here, I quote Meenakshi Mukherjee from that book, The Twice Born Fiction. Anand's ardor for social revolution, his conviction in salvation through socialistic doctrines are undisguised in his novels. His strength as well as his weakness stems from this fervent belief, this very fervent belief. So two things interest Mukherjee in particular. One, the heroes of Mulk Raj Anand, and the other, representation of Gandhi in his fiction. She argues that the protagonists in Anand's fiction are, quote, rugged individualists who suffer because they refuse to conform. For Mukherjee, Bhakha the untouchable, Munnu the coolie, Bhikhu the quote-unquote chamar, and Lal Singh of the trilogy all are indomitable in spirit, but persecuted by others for their non-conformity. As for Gandhi, she maintains that Anand's treatment differs from others because he does not idealize Gandhi. He never idealizes Gandhi. An accurate observation this is, because though Bhakha likes Gandhi, he feels offended when Gandhi advises the outcasts not to drink or gamble and maintain hygiene. That is why I called Mukherjee's comment on Gandhi, on the representation of Gandhi, an accurate one. Bhakha thinks Gandhi is blaming untouchables. His heart is set on the machine that the young poet mentions. He doesn't find a solution to his problems in Gandhi. Rather, he feels that flush system can remedy the problems of the outcasts. However, Meenakshi Mukherjee praises Anand for his forward-looking approach, scientific rationalism, unconventional diction, and experiments with style. Now, I would like to move on to Gauri Vishwanathan's reading of Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable. Gauri Vishwanathan is primarily concerned with the absence of Ambedkar from Anand's Untouchable. Vishwanathan, in her book Outside the Fold, Conversion, Modernity and Belief, that came out in 1998, points out that Untouchable was written, quote, in the time period of Ambedkar's quarrels with Gandhi over the communal award, and published in exactly the same year as Ambedkar's decision to convert, unquote. Yet, the fact that the novel makes no mention of Ambedkar at all takes her by surprise. She argues further that Anand celebrates Gandhi as the savior of the outcasts, interpreting the issue of separate electorate from Gandhi's viewpoint. And she finds this approach quite problematic. And I quote Vishwanathan, in adopting Gandhi's perspective, Anand's narrative alienates and marginalizes the assertion of Dalit will, and totally ignores the debate initiated by Ambedkar on the same issue. It is worth mentioning here that Ambedkar, claiming to represent that very Dalit will, had burnt the Manusmriti in 1927 at Mahad. After looking at Meenakshi Mukherjee's and Gauri Vishwanathan's reading of Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, I would like to move on to the third eminent critique called Priyambada Gopal. And Priyambada Gopal's book, the Indian English novel Nation, History and Narration, that came out in 2009, can be a good starting point to understand her reading of Anand's Untouchable. Gopal classifies Untouchable somewhere between ethnography and fiction. She criticizes Anand's conception of the outcasts in Untouchable as submissive, because they are waiting for some compassionate agents to uplift them. She argues that by the 1930s, Untouchables had organized themselves and were agitating under Ambedkar's leadership. She also focuses on the omniscient narrator who, in referring to Bhaka and his community as quote unquote them or these people, distances itself from the outcasts, because omniscient narrator refers to Dalits as them or these people. So, Priyambada Gopal finds this kind of othering of Dalits by the narrator as problematic, because in doing so the narrator is distancing itself from the outcasts. She is equally critical of Anand's patronizing attitude towards the outcasts, arguing that, and I quote, for all his unstinting condemnation of mainstream Hindus' exploitative caste practices, Anand shares with Gandhi unexamined assumptions about untouchables and their purported amendment of the original Hindu instinct for cleanliness, unquote. Despite the aforesaid criticisms, the narrative of exclusion that Anand builds upon will continue to appeal to readers across world, and that tells us about the relevance of Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable in contemporary times. Though Indian Constitution has abolished untouchability and introduced affirmative action programs for the uplift of the downtrodden, reports on atrocities committed against Dalits are often carried out in newspapers. In independent India, the condition of the outcasts has improved undoubtedly a great deal due to these affirmative actions, yet a lot is to be done for bringing the poor and the suppressed to the mainstream. So, I would like to conclude this lecture with some lines from Om Prakash Balmiki's poem Thakur's Well, Thakur Ka Kuan, which goes like this: Kuan Thakur ka, पानी ठाकुर का, खेत खलिहान ठाकुर के, गली मोहल्ले ठाकुर के, फिर अपना क्या, गांव, शहर, देश. And I have roughly translated this into English. The well belongs to the landlord, so does water. The farm and the granaries belong to the landlord. The streets and the villages belong to the landlord. Then what is ours? The village, the city, the nation. So, these are the concluding lines that builds upon the narrative of deprivation in the poem. Thank you.